Hey guys, so I am going to give you the last bit of notes that you need for your test on Friday. So remember your test on Friday. Test Friday is over Unit 1, or Unit 0, I'm sorry, which had characteristics of science and the characteristics of life, which were hog record. And Unit 1A. Today we'll do the last bit of your information for your test, which is on food chains and food webs. And then yesterday you guys did some notes on levels of an ecosystem and of the environment. So make sure that you have all this information ready for your test on Friday. So we are going to talk about food webs and food chains, but before we get there, we have to understand that energy flows in one direction through an ecosystem. And energy all starts with the sun, which is the star at the very center of our solar system, and we revolve around it, and all life on Earth depends on it. So there wouldn't be any energy that we would be able to acquire from the food that we eat if it wasn't for the sun. So everything starts with the sun and builds up on that. Because next is our producers. So producers are organisms that can make their own food, and they make it through photosynthesis. Right, photosynthesis. So they take energy from the sun and they create their own food with it. So organisms like plants, certain types of bacteria and fungi as well, but what you just need to know is that plants create their own food with the sun. So we eat some of these plants. We eat, when you have a salad, or if you have any fruits or vegetables, all of those are plants that get energy from the sun and grow, and then we are able to harness that food that way. Then you have consumers. We are an example of a consumer. A cat, gazelle, a lion, any type of organism that has to rely on other organisms for food. So there's different types. Obviously, there are organisms like us where we can eat plants and animals. There are organisms that are like lions, carnivores. They can only eat, like lions, they can only eat other animals. So any type of consumer, basically anything that has to get food from another by eating something else. Unlike producers, they can make their own food. Okay, so consumers are basically any kind of thing other than a plant. Gets their energy by eating or consuming other organisms. So we said energy flows in one direction through an ecosystem. This slide shows everything that we have summarized so far. You have the sun, everything starts here, right? That is the starting point, number 1. Flows in one direction. So everything from the sun goes to our producers. Remember, our producers make that. Our producers are plants, things that create their own food, okay? And then we have a consumer. So a consumer eats plants, right? Humans are an example of this. We can eat plants. Other organisms that maybe just eat plants would be like a gazelle or a giraffe or a rabbit, something like that, okay? But you could have humans, animals, really any type of organism that can't make its own food. So a consumer. All right, and then we have decomposers. We won't worry too much about decomposers today. We'll talk more about it next week after your test. But you do have decomposers. So let's say after our consumers die or excrete waste, then you have decomposers that break up everything that the consumer didn't use or the consumer itself and breaks it down into an organic nutrient pool. Okay, but I want you guys to worry about is just this first part, the sun to producers to consumers. So just worry about this first part of the graph for this week. Sun, producers, consumers. Okay, So some other words to describe producers and consumers are autotrophic and heterotrophic. So producers are always going to be autotrophic. They make their own food. So auto actually means self, and troph means food. So a lot of biology and a lot of scientific terms are based in Greek or Latin. So auto is, that first term auto is Latin for self, or meaning like, you know, like you. And then troph, T-R-O-P-H, is Latin for food. So organisms that create their own food or self-food are producers. So those type of things are plants, mostly plants, okay? And they do this through photosynthesis, which obviously requires the sun. You guys know that. Consumers are heterotroph. So troph again means food, and hetero means other. So again, hetero means other. So that means I am going to get food from another source. Heterotrophic. So they need organisms to obtain their food. So like a bear is a good example of that. Humans, really anything that's not a plant. Humans, animals, okay, anything that's not a plant. Bacteria, a lot of bacteria do this. Fungi, all right? So producers and consumers. Remember, producers are photosynthetic organisms, sorry. Those are plants. Those are also called autotrophs, remember? And then consumers, we know that there are 3 different types of consumers. Those are animals. So producers are always going to be at the bottom, and that's because it starts with the sun, and then after the sun you have plants, or you have your producers, okay? The sun and then there. So they're always going to be kind of represented at the bottom of our food chain or our food web. And you can think of it as that they're the base. After the sun, they are the base of every food chain and food web. Everything starts there because they harness the sun's energy and then create and are able to create energy from that. So consumers, remember there's 3 different types, and you've heard this word before: herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. So herbivores are consumers that are going to eat producers. They're only going to eat plants. Examples of herbivores would be cows, rabbits, other organisms that you know of that only eat plants. Okay. Consumers that are going to eat other consumers are carnivores. So they eat meat. So organisms that only eat meat would be like lions, some types of bears, cats, things like that. They only eat meat. Then there are some consumers that are going to eat both. These are called omnivores. Okay, let's see if I can get this to work. So these are called omnivores. They're going to eat meat and plants. Examples of omnivores are humans, your household dog. I mean, anything that can eat meat and plants. And then decomposers are going to finish off the rest of the remains. So any waste material or dead things, decomposers. So we've been talking about different components of a food chain or a food web. All right, and it's important that you guys know the difference between each one. So a food chain is a series of organisms in which energy is transferred from one organism to another. So it's very linear. This should have an arrow. It should have arrows that point all up into just one direction, like so. You would start with plants, or you actually should start with the sun. And then each arrow shows energy flow, just goes all the way up to the chain to our highest consumer. All right, we have a producer, the plant, and then energy flows from that to our grasshopper. The grasshopper gets the energy from the plant by eating it. Then it flows up to the bird, another consumer, eats the grasshopper below it, and so on and so forth. A food web, on the other hand, is a network of feeding interactions through which both energy and matter move. So this just shows energy. Food web shows both. And what's important to notice is this word network right here. So this is much more realistic to real life and what you would find out in the environment. So you're going to find lots of different types of producers. And let's just say that this is in one ecosystem, okay, where you have many different types of producers. And again, the sun should also be represented here. And you have many different animals that live in the same area. So, you know, this is something that you might find in Georgia, where you have wolves, probably more like coyotes. You have hawks, you have different snakes, you have rats and mice, you have different types of birds, insects. All of them would be in like one forest or woods near your house. And you would have not just one type of animal or one type of plant, but many different types. And so this is going to be much more complex, a food web, and it looks kind of like a web. It's more complex. It's a network of energy. So this is another slide that shows the difference between a food chain and a food web. So again, a chain starts from the sun, one arrow after the next goes to, you know, either the final consumer or a decomposer, and that's it. It just shows one story. Versus a food web, this is a food web. It has arrows going in multiple different ways. It is a network. It shows many different stories. Food chain shows one story, from producer to one consumer to the next consumer to the next to the next. Versus a food web shows, oh, the sun creates this type of plant, a grasshopper could eat that type of plant. And then maybe a spider could eat the grasshopper, or a hawk could eat the grasshopper. Okay, so this shows many different stories. This shows one story. For both of them, arrows show the flow of energy. Usually it goes from the bottom to the top. So what we mean by bottom, now usually it's depicted by the bottom, like literally wildflowers or grass, like the producer is literally at the bottom and then it'll go up. Depends on what picture we're looking at, but so each of these arrows shows energy flow. It's always going to flow from the object to what's eating it. So a rabbit is going to eat the grass, but the grass, the energy that's found in the grass is going to go to the rabbit when it eats it. So everything will point upwards, grass to rabbit. If the hawk is eating the rabbit, the energy that comes from the rabbit itself, the meat of the rabbit, will point up towards the hawk because the hawk is going to eat that. So the hawk will acquire energy from what's below it, the rabbit. The rabbit acquires energy from grass flow. So the arrows show the flow of energy, flow of energy. So this is just another example that shows a food web. So again, this is a food web because it shows a network. It shows many different stories. Big indicator that you're looking at a web and not a, let me move my face, that you're looking at a web and not a food chain is there's all these different arrows, okay? So let's look up here at the top, our marsh hawk. Up here, and I'm actually from the marsh. I'm from, not from the marsh, but I'm from the coast. I'm from down by Savannah, and I grew up with the marsh in my backyard, so that's why I always love using this example. So you have a hawk. A hawk could get food from this clapper rail or from the shrew or from the harvest mouse. This is showing that a hawk, our marsh hawk, can eat any of these things. All right? This ribbed mussel right here, ribbed mussel, can get food from either a decomposer like these worms or from a marsh grass. So this shows that our mussel, our ribbed mussel right here, can eat plants and animals, so it's an herbivore. These are some questions these are the types of questions that you might get on your test. I might ask you, is the heron a carnivore or an herbivore or a producer? And you could see that the heron gets food from plankton or fish and from mussels. So if our heron eats fish and mussels, so eats two organisms or two animals, then that would make it a carnivore. Okay, and this shows different levels. It shows, carnivores are mostly at the top of our food web and our food chains. Carnivores, remember, they're organisms that eat only animals, only meat. In the middle, you're going to have, in the middle of your food web or food chain, you might have herbivores, or you might have omnivores, organisms that can eat both. And I just realized I made a mistake by saying that that our mussel was an herbivore, because it shows, this shows that it actually eats, if it eats animals and plants, then our ribbed mussel is actually an omnivore. Don't make that mistake like I did. Okay? Organisms that just eat grass, like, let's see if anything just eats grass, would be our, maybe our sandhopper or grasshopper. Grasshopper is a great example of an herbivore. So remember, herbivore, they just eat plants. Omnivore eats plants and animals. And then a carnivore just eats animals. Okay? All right, last example. We have our producers. So tree would be a producer. Shrub, producer. Bacteria would be a decomposer. Grass, producer. Fungi, it's actually a decomposer. Fungi are weird though. They're decomposers and they're not producers. So anyways, so we've got our producers. Remember, producers create food for themselves. They're called autotrophs. And they create food from the sun. They use photosynthesis from the sun. Our arrows show energy moving up to our very top levels, which are usually carnivores, top level consumers. Okay? If you have an organism like a deer, this deer eats trees and shrubs. And I don't see any other arrows pointing to our deer. So our deer eats shrubs, it gains energy from shrubs and trees. So our deer is going to be a consumer, and it's going to be an herbivore. All right, let's see. Look at this shrew right here. Our shrew gets energy from a grasshopper. So it looks like shrews only eat grasshoppers. I can't find any other arrows that point towards it. So our shrew, our little shrew, is a carnivore. Consumer and a carnivore, only eats meat. But look at all these organisms that eat shrews. A mountain lion can eat a shrew. A snake can eat a shrew. A hawk can eat a shrew. So you see these arrows are pointing all over the place, so that means this is going to be a food web. Food web. If I just showed one story of fungi to squirrel to hawk, then that would be a food chain. But when I incorporate all of these different stories, then that is a food web.